Hi, my name is Nick Kruger, and I'm sorry that I'm unable to be with you in person today, but I figured a recorded lecture on YouTube is better than a no lecture. And so I've got a Google slide presentation and then a document activity that you could use in your classes. And I talk about binary oppositions in class. And I found that this is both a topic which is useful in the course as it relates to a lot of the books we teach and also provides students a lot of topics to write about. And also just that they find the topic to be interesting. And because it, in addition to relating to literature, really strongly relates to the world around us and how we construct reality and meaning. So the first thing that I bring up with them before I even really get into a lecture about what binary oppositions are, I talk about words. And we use words with a very high degree of confidence. But words in and of themselves don't mean anything. They're just symbols of sound that we have loosely agreed on the meaning of these things. And yet, in our lives, we use them with confidence, as if there is a concrete meaning on them to which we all agree. While this general agreement is, in a sense, true, which is another interesting binary that we'll get into as we talk about things they carried, words are very slippery little things. And yet, we use them to structure both our inner and outer realities, and also to describe the things going on within us to other people. Now, when I was an undergrad, one of my favorite all-time teachers and professors, her name was Dr. Ann Brady. She taught one course on Dante and she taught one course on T.S. Eliot. I was fortunate enough to take them both. And one part of the T.S. Eliot course from T.S. Eliot's work, the Four Quartets, the Bert Norton poem specifically, has stuck out with me since my undergrad days. And partially because she talked about how she included this bit of the poem in every sympathy card she's ever written. And the reason she does is if you've ever tried to write a sympathy card, it's very difficult to find words to fit the gravity of the situation and words that would provide comfort and understanding and that could help the person who experienced the loss in any way. And this bit of the poem really just kind of acknowledges that words aren't always suitable for the gravity of the situation we're trying to describe. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break. Under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. And whether you're writing about a sympathy card or having a conversation with a loved one, a partner or a spouse or a significant other, and you're trying to describe what's going on within you to them in a way that makes them understand you and how you're feeling, it's really difficult. And this is an experience that students can really understand because everyone's had that experience of struggling to find the right words to fit what you're trying to describe. Now, to illustrate this point, I have the students try to define the word good, right? Now, this is a very basic word, and it's a word that students have used ever since they were small children and probably use on a day-to-day basis. And then I have them share their definitions aloud. We talk about this, and then I use some of those explanations in terms to describe different concepts. The pizza was good. The movie was good. The relationship was good. I had a good time. They did a good job in their presentation. And what I'm trying to show the students is, while in essence, the word good describes each of these ideas, the word good also contains slightly different connotations for each description. There's a lot of variance in the meaning of this really basic word that we have used for so much of our lives. Now, if they struggle to define the word good, which they typically do, they know what it means, and they've used it so much but trying to describe what it means is not easy because the word good, which is a symbol, which in and of itself is meaningless, you need the word bad to define it against. Concepts like good and bad seem harmless enough, but we take these two words that don't mean anything, and the only way they have any meaning is defining it against another symbol, which in and of itself has no meaning. Now, good and bad, as I said, relatively harmless, because if you say the movie was good or the pizza was bad, you know more or less what we're talking about. However, we use words to describe much more complex and sophisticated ideas. Love, freedom, equality, civilized, savage, brave. Words that really we have used to shape both our country, our democracy, our world, and our understanding of it. And my students have found this concept to be interesting because it makes them look at literature and the world in a different way, as merely a construction. It's also a useful way to explore and write about literature. And I found that this really shows up in a lot of different texts And just of the books that I teach, it works very well in Heart of Darkness and Things Fall Apart. The Things They Carried, which is what the activity that I have for you if you wanted to use it with your students at the end, and also Sula. Speaking of good, Sula, the scene near the end where Sula is dying and she talks to Nell, and as Nell's leaving, she said, "You talk about being good, how do you know it was you?" And there's only been a handful of books in my life where I felt like I really had the rug pulled out from me, and it in a way that didn't feel cheap, right? And so with this one, it really forced me to go back and look at the whole rest of the book again. She talks about being good to people or being evil to people is the same thing. It's risky. And that really does a good job of kind of getting at what I'm getting at with these binaries, because Sula really deconstructs and upends that binary, right? And takes the privileged term, which would be good, and shows that evil they're very, very similar. And whether you're treating people well or treating people badly, you don't know what you're going to get, or you don't know how they're going to take that, or you don't know what the effect is going to be. And so there's a risk inherent in each one. Now, some notes that I use to have students take notes on, and a couple of these are from the very text that I used when I was in graduate school. So I think we have a more recent edition, so there may be a better definition of this. But one of the main points of post-structuralism was to deconstruct the binary opposition. And so we look at how these two terms relate to each other, right? And we really kind of break that down. Showing firstly that the distinction between the paired opposites is not absolute, right? As I just showed with Sula, right? Good and evil, they seem like very simple and absolute and concrete terms, but you can change how those terms work with each other. Since each term in the pairing can only be understood and defined in terms of the other, and secondly, it's possible to reverse the hierarchy within such pairs, and so to privilege the second term rather than the first, as Sula does with evil and good. This paradox reflects the way the world of literature is simultaneously a recognizable version of the world we live in, and also an inversion of that world. And one of the things I really love about literature is it allows me as a teacher to get into and discuss really complex societal issues in a way which is safe, right? And in a way which is not necessarily as overtly political, because I'm not talking about real politicians or real governments, but the ideas are there, right? And I found that students are very capable of making that transference from talking about the ideas we talk about in literature and then transferring them to our world in a way which doesn't require me to lead them by the hand to that. For the deconstructionists, again, such moments are symptomatic of the way language doesn't reflect or convey our world, but constitutes a world of its own, a kind of parallel universe or virtual reality. And for me, a parallel universe in which it allows us to discuss the complex, complicated, maybe controversial issues that take place in our own reality. Now, from a different text, we often encounter binary oppositions in cultural studies when exploring the relationships between different groups of people. For instance, upper class and lower class, male and female, or developed and underdeveloped, and so on. On the surface, these seem merely like identifying labels, but what makes them binary opposites is the notion that they cannot coexist, right? So we look at the terms upper class and lower class, right? And what we're really talking about is socioeconomic situations, but upper class are people who generally have more money, and lower class are people who generally have less money. But the word class is an interesting one, right? Because what this is implying is not only does the upper class have more money, but they are classier, they're more sophisticated, they're more peaceful, they're better, they treat people better, because lower class is seen as a negative, in addition to just the act of having less money. But what we see in our world is, while people who don't have a lot of money sometimes treat each other badly, the people on the top who have a lot of money oftentimes treat a whole bunch of people quite badly, right? If you look at, Amazon and things like that, the people on the top are not treating people really well, right? And so, but by using these terms, it really privileges the upper class over the lower class, because it makes it sound, and because we all kind of agree on these terms loosely, makes everyone understand that the people on the top who have a lot more money are better, even though that's generally not the case. The problem with a system of binary opposites is that it creates boundaries between groups of people and leads to prejudice and discrimination. And this is a really good way for, as I talked about, extending the conversation about literature to the lives of our students around them. One group may fear or consider a threat the opposite group, referred to as the other. And this is a concept that we've talked at great length in CIS. And also, the use of binary opposition in literature is a system that authors use to explore differences between groups of individuals, such as cultural, class, or gender differences. One of the reasons to think about the ways in which binaries have underpinned geopolitics is to see how their construction and application have been a part of nationalist myths and geopolitical codes. Now, this fits quite well as an example with Heart of Darkness. And one of the journal topics I give, and I think this is a fairly common one, but I think it's you can flesh it out a lot better by bringing up this binary opposition stuff. Heart of Darkness seems to blur the line between so-called civilized society of Europe and the savage society of Africa. What makes one culture civilized and another savage in the eyes of the world? Are these distinctions valid? Do you think that the culture you live in is civilized? For this essay, deconstruct the binary opposition of civilized and savage. And so what I do to begin with is I have the students, I just put civilized on one column and savage on the other, and I have them brainstorm ideas and concepts and terms that come to mind when they think of these, right? And generally, the terms with civilized are educated and peaceful and sophisticated and calm and ordered and clean and nonviolent, and savage are the opposites, right? So it's violent and uneducated and not governed by laws and all these different things. But what Heart of Darkness does, because Heart of Darkness as a text really deconstructs this, is it shows that while the Europeans label themselves civilized and the African people as savage, there's almost no evidence of the European people behaving in a civilized way, right? Almost everything we see is a savage act after savage act on the part of the Europeans. And while there's not a great deal of evidence in the book about the African people behaving in a civilized way, just because there's not a whole bunch of information about the people from Africa, the scene with the cannibals is a perfect illustration of this, right? Now, Marlowe, in his mind, is to a point deconstructing this, right? He refuses to allow himself to really complete this deconstruction, and he almost goes insane by trying not to complete that process, right? And that's because he never really takes that last step and says, you know what, it turns out that the European people are savage and the people from Africa are civilized, and therefore what the European people are doing is bad, because that wouldn't be as interesting or it wouldn't yield as fruitful discussion. We're forced to take that last step for him, right? And that's where the interpretive power of literature, and it makes it a good text for this class, comes in. In Heart of Darkness, we discuss and deconstruct the concept of being civilized versus being savage. The Europeans label themselves as civilized and the Africans as savage. Thus, those in Europe can do whatever they feel they need to do against the savages because, according to this constructed definition, the Africans were lower than the Europeans. The Europeans privileged themselves over the Africans. Thus, the Europeans can treat the Africans in any way they like because, according to the definitions that the Europeans have constructed themselves, they are helping the savages. However, the book shows that the civilized Europeans acting more savage than the Africans, right? Now, a good example of how this binary plays out are characters like the aunt and the intended, right? If you look at the things that they view and believe are going on that the company is doing, they're weaning the ignorant millions from their horrid ways, right? And they have the capacity to do almost unlimited good, right? These terms are important, right? Because they shape the way we understand the world. And as I've said, discussing these as it pertains to literature is a good kind of jumping off point for discussing them in the world around us. Now, as this relates to the things they carried, so I start with a quick reminder of, a little lecture on this, but binary oppositions are all over the place in things they carried, right? And as we deconstruct them, it really shows, kind of the fog of war and how complicated things are. So the things they carried is full of binary oppositions, and we'll be looking at several in class, and I allow students to write journals or essays about this. First, looking at the chapters Friends and Enemies, right? Because this is one of the most obvious ones. It seems like you know who your friends are and you know who your enemies are, but as we see in the book, war really kind of blurs that lines, right? So when you talk about who should be friends in the story, people on the same side, people from the United States should be friends. But as we see in the story, the argument over the jackknife, people who should be friends become enemies, right? And it isn't until they have the scene where, one of them breaks their own nose and it turns out that the original guy did actually steal the jackknife, that this is broken down, right? And they go from being enemies to friends again, right? And then the story Enemies, the two characters decide that if one of them gets gravely injured, that they're going to kill the other person, right? And this brings up topics in the book like you generally would kill your enemy, but in this instance, you're being forced to kill your friend, right? And when the soldier gets his knee blown off, his leg blown off, he begs his friend to not kill him, right? And so generally, if you ask someone to not kill you, that should be something that a friend would do. But because he promised and he felt guilt about this until the helicopter accident, he felt like he was behaving more like an enemy, right? Then, as we go through, how do these stories deconstruct the binary opposition of friends and enemies and help show the confusion of war? Another prevalent binary opposition in the text is the idea of bravery versus shame or cowardice, right? And this shows up in a number of different stories. The Dentist is a good short example. Up on the Rainy River is a more extended example, but I think Dentist is a good jumping off place, right? And so the dentist shows up and the character is afraid of the dentist, but rather than show that he's afraid, at first he faints and then he leaves, and then he has the dentist pull out a perfectly good tooth, right? And so rather than showing that he's afraid, he does something that's really stupid to demonstrate that he's brave. Explain how that deconstructs the binary opposition of bravery versus shame and cowardice. How does it make you look at the idea of bravery differently? And then Up on the Rainy River is the same thing, right? Ending with the ultimate deconstruction of this: I was a coward, I went to war, right? And finally, if the students have time, or you want to extend this into another class, the whole point of the book is what is true and what is not. What is reality and what is unreality? And by telling stories which are not factually true, but the more capital T true, story truth, he's really getting closer to what the truth of the situation is. And this is one of the reasons I really enjoy teaching this book. And I think that this activity in relation and also with the kind of discussion of binary oppositions really brings up some interesting points about the book and the world we live in. So if you had any questions on this, you could certainly send me an email. I will include that at the bottom of my little thing here. But very quickly before I go, I just wanted to say one quick thing. Since I'm not here in person, I wanted to say thank you, Tony. I've really enjoyed working with you and learning from you. And you've done such a wonderful job. And maybe even more than that, in a world which increasingly feels as if the center cannot hold. And if you listen carefully from time to time, you can hear that rough beast slouching around out there. You've been a source of good and fighting the good fight and trying to make the world a better place. And so as a moral role model, I can't thank you enough. So thank you for all your work, and I hope you have the best retirement. Take care.